June 1944. Hereford, Texas. The glass felt wrong in her hand. Too heavy, too smooth. Condensation slid down its curved side, leaving a wet ring on the raw wood of the table. Inside, a dark liquid fizzed. Elena watched a tiny bubble climb, pop, and vanish. The air smelled of dust and a sweet, alien spice, something like medicine, but not. Around her, the other women murmured. Some held their glasses with suspicion, others with a kind of desperate curiosity. She lifted hers. The cold shocked her palm. A dark liquid bubbling. She had seen nothing like it. Not in Rome, not during the fighting in the north, not in the long, stinking journey across the ocean. This was something else. A new world's concoction. A young American guard, a boy with a face that burned easily in the relentless sun, had set the tray down with a thud, his movements clumsy with an unreadable emotion. Not pity, not contempt. Something more unsettling. A kind of blankness. He made a gesture with his hand, an encouraging scoop toward his own mouth, and smiled a brief, toothy smile before retreating. The gesture was meant to be universal. Drink. But the meaning was lost. They were prisoners. Women of the Servizio Ausiliario Feminile, captured fighting for a losing cause, an idea of Italy that was burning to the ground 6,000 miles away. Prisoners did not receive treats. They received rations, punishments, orders. This was none of those. This was an anomaly. Elena brought the glass to her lips. The smell intensified. She tilted it. The fizz stung her tongue, 1,000 tiny needles. Then came the sweetness. A flood of it, thick and overwhelming, coating her mouth, her throat. It was nothing like the thin, saccharine sweetness of a hoarded sugar cube. This was industrial, aggressive, a sweetness with no memory of a beet or a cane, only of a factory. She swallowed, and the cold ache spread through her chest. She looked at Pyrrha, whose face was a mask of confusion. Pyrrha, who could tell you the caloric content of a turnip from 20 paces, just stared at the liquid as if it were an explosive. Elena set the glass down. A single sip had told her everything and nothing. It told her she was no longer in a world of scarcity, of carefully measured existence. But it did not tell her what kind of world she was in now. She looked out the mess hall window, past the guard tower and the taut lines of barbed wire, to the horizon. It was a perfectly flat line, a geometric absolute she had never known in the rolling hills of her homeland. The sky was enormous, empty, an empty sky over a flat, hot land where they served you sweet, black poison in a cold glass. From that single, bewildering sip, the scope of their new reality began to unfold. The drink, they would learn, was called Coca-Cola. It was one detail in a universe of incomprehensible facts. The women in the barracks at Hereford, Texas, were a historical footnote, an administrative headache for the American War Department. They were just under 300 Italian women, captured auxiliaries of Mussolini's last-ditch Salo Republic, shipped to the United States because no one knew what else to do with them. They were ideologues, true believers, and also secretaries, nurses, and radio operators who had thrown their lot in with a cause that was now indefensible. In Italy, they were traitors to the new government. To the Americans, they were fascists, enemies, yet also women. This last fact seemed to cause a system-wide short-circuit. The camp at Hereford was a sprawling, orderly grid carved out of the panhandle dust. It was built to hold thousands of German and Italian men, soldiers of a conventional sort. The arrival of several hundred women, in their dark, severe uniforms, threw the camp's rigid logic into quiet disarray. The women saw it in the guards' faces, in the way an officer would stop mid-sentence when he entered their compound. They were an unexpected variable in a vast, logistical equation. Their world had shrunk to this dusty square, governed by bells and whistles and the movements of the sun. But within this confinement, another world was being forced upon them, a world of bewildering surplus. It was a world they perceived through a constant, low-grade sensory shock. The bread was the first sign after the strange drink. It was snow-white, unnaturally soft, and came in uniform slices. To Pyrrha, who had spent the last 2 years thinking of bread in terms of grams and grim necessity, the sight of entire loaves, Untouched, being scraped into a garbage can was a physical blow. She felt an echo of hunger in her own stomach, a reflexive anger. She saw the American cooks, their movements casual, wasteful. They were not rationing. They were not conserving. They were simply processing material, and some of it was designated as waste. This was not the logic of war, as they had known it. The war they knew was a thing of patched clothes, of reused tea bags, of a single potato boiled 3 different ways. Here, the war seemed to exist only on the crackling radio news broadcasts and the flickering newsreels they were sometimes shown. Inside the wire, another logic prevailed. It was a logic of a country so rich it could afford to house its enemies in relative comfort, a nation that could project its power not just with bombs and bullets, but with Hershey bars and hot water. The stakes for the women were no longer about immediate survival. They were fed, they were sheltered, they were safe from the chaos consuming their homes. The new stakes were psychological. How were they to remain who they were, dedicated soldiers of an ascetic, sacrificial ideology, in a place that was methodically, impersonally, and relentlessly comfortable? Their identities had been forged in hardship. Here, there was no hardship to sharpen themselves against. There was only the wind, the dust, and the endless, baffling abundance. The collision of their two worlds played out in a series of daily, tangible contrasts. It was a silent argument staged in calories, textures, and the allocation of time. Back in the Republic of Salo, a meal was a victory over starvation. Pyrrha could still recall the precise, meager weight of the daily bread ration, 150 grams. It was dark, dense, and often flecked with things that were not flour. Coffee was a bitter brew of roasted acorns. A sliver of cheese was a treasure. Here, at Hereford, the mess hall trays were heavy with food that seemed designed to be eaten, not savored. Hamburgers appeared, a baffling construction of soft white bread and thick patties of ground meat. The women poked at them, dissecting them, trying to understand their form and function. They were served ice cream, a substance many had only read about. It was so cold it made their teeth ache, a pure, creamy sweetness that felt utterly decadent. They were allotted, according to a notice Elena translated from the mess hall wall, over 3,000 calories per day. This number was an abstraction, a meaningless figure, until Louisa, who had been a nurse in Milan, did a silent calculation. It was nearly 3 times the average civilian ration in the final year of the war. It was the diet of a nation that had never been hungry. The contrast extended to their bodies, to the very fabric of their lives. Their uniforms, the symbol of their commitment, were worn, mended, and remended. A missing button was a crisis. A tear was a strategic failure to be remedied with careful stitching in the dim barracks light. In Hereford, they were issued American military workwear. Harsher fabric, shapeless and drab, but new. There was no need to mend it. If it tore, you could get another. The very idea of this disposability was a moral shock. They saw it in the small things. Bars of soap, individually wrapped, when they were used to sharing a single, dwindling sliver among a dozen women. Hot showers, a luxury so profound it felt like a sin. Pyrrha found herself saving the soap wrappers, smoothing them out, unable to discard something so perfectly made. It was a reflex from a world of scarcity that had no meaning here. The most profound contrast, however, was in the realm of information and sound. Their world in Italy had been sonically sealed. The state controlled the airwaves. Music was martial or grandly operatic, the anthems of Verdi and the Fascist Party. News was a curated narrative of heroic struggle and inevitable victory. Here, the air itself was different. The camp's loudspeakers, once used to bark orders, now played music from the Armed Forces radio network. It was jazz, a music of loose rhythms, of slides and slurs, of an individualism so profound it sounded to Louisa like pure chaos. It had no marching beat, no soaring chorus for the collective. It was the sound of private moods, of improvisation. It was the sonic equivalent of a hamburger, unstructured, indulgent, and deeply, confusingly American. They saw newsreels that showed American factories churning out endless streams of airplanes and tanks, scenes of well-fed citizens buying things in glittering shops. It was a portrayal of the enemy's power that was more demoralizing than any propaganda about their wickedness. It showed a capacity so vast, it made their own fierce, desperate struggle seem pathetic, a historical curiosity. These bewildering contrasts were filtered through the consciousness of the women, each processing the new reality according to her own temperament. They became amateur anthropologists in the land of their captors, their observations a silent running commentary on the absurdity of their situation. Elena, the quiet observer, turned her sharp, analytical mind to the camp itself. She began to notice the patterns. The supply trucks arrived on Tuesdays and Fridays, always at the same time. The guards changed shifts with a predictable, almost lazy precision. She saw that their captors' power wasn't in their rifles, but in their schedules, their logistics, their clipboards. Her interiority was a ledger of facts. She would lie on her cot at night and tally the day's inputs. 3 meals, 2 new bars of soap issued, 26 loaves of white bread in the bin outside the kitchen. She wasn't judging. She was merely recording the data of this new world, trying to find the underlying equation. It was through Elena's eyes that the others began to understand the scale of the operation. She saw a young guard, no older than her nephew, casually toss a half-eaten apple toward a fence post. He wasn't being cruel or wasteful in a malicious way. It was a gesture of pure thoughtlessness, the kind that comes only from a life where there has always been another apple. That, Elena thought, was the real difference. They had been taught that sacrifice was a virtue. Here, there was nothing to sacrifice. Pyrrha, whose hands were still calloused from a life of farm work, saw the world in terms of resources. The waste was a personal affront, an offense against the natural order of things. She saw the rich, dark Texas soil inside the compound and felt a physical ache. They were given seeds and tools, but they were told to plant flowers. Flowers, to beautify the camp. The American officer had explained, his voice patient, as if speaking to a child. Pyrrha looked at the man's clean, uncalloused hands and felt a chasm open between them. She knew what this soil could do. It could grow potatoes, beans, tomatoes. It could feed a family for a winter. The idea of using it for something as useless as a zinnia was a form of madness. She began to collect things in secret, scraps of cloth, bits of string, the paper napkins from the mess hall. She folded them into neat squares and hid them under her mattress, a small, futile act of rebellion against the logic of disposability. Then there was Louisa, the true believer. For her, the camp was not a prison, but a battlefield of the mind. Every comfort was a weapon, every act of kindness a trap. The Coca-Cola was poison meant to rot their discipline. The jazz was an acid meant to dissolve their moral fiber. The soft bread was a sedative to lull them into compliance. She would watch the other women, her gaze sharp, vigilant. She saw a younger girl, Sophia, humming along to a swing tune on the radio, and her heart hardened. "They're trying to make us forget who we are," she whispered to Elena one night, her voice tight with conviction. But Elena, watching the same scene, had a different thought. She wasn't sure the Americans were trying to do anything to them at all. She was beginning to suspect something far more disorienting, that they weren't the focus of the story. They were just living inside a system that was running on its own, for its own reasons, and they were merely incidental to it. The system was the revelation. It was the invisible architecture that explained every baffling detail, from the sweet, fizzy drink to the bewildering kindness of the guards. Slowly, through pamphlets left in the recreation hall and conversations overheard and painstakingly translated, the women began to grasp the mechanism that governed their lives. It was not a program of re-education. It was not a sophisticated psychological operation. It was bureaucracy. Specifically, it was the 1929 Geneva Convention. Elena found a copy of a summary, printed in Italian, and read it aloud to the others in the dim light of the barracks. The words were dry, legalistic, but they landed like a bombshell. The treaty, an international agreement on the humane treatment of prisoners, stipulated that prisoners of war must receive the same quantity and quality of rations as the detaining power's own base-level depot troops. The causal chain was simple, impersonal, and devastating. The United States of America, a signatory to the convention, had an army fed by the most productive industrial and agricultural machine in human history. That machine produced a standard, high-calorie diet for its soldiers. Therefore, by the unthinking, automatic logic of the treaty, captured fascist auxiliaries from a starving, shattered nation were to be given the exact same diet. There was no malice in their former starvation, and there was no kindness in their current abundance. It was simply policy. This discovery was more shocking than any cruelty would have been. Cruelty, at least, was personal. It implied that you mattered enough to be hated. This was the opposite. This was indifference on a global, industrial scale. The schematic metaphor that formed in Elena's mind was that of a vast machine, a factory. A factory for processing prisoners. The machine had been designed and calibrated to process men, soldiers, components of a predictable size and shape. Now the women of the SAF, had been fed into it. The machine did not know they were women. It did not know they were fascists. It did not know they had been raised on an ideology of scarcity and sacrifice. It only followed its programming. Input, 1 prisoner. Output, 1 bed, 3,000 calories of food, a certain allotment of soap and clothing. The machine was not good or evil. It was merely efficient. This realization began to shift the women's perceptions. They had been trying to interpret the camp's features as messages directed at them. But the messages were not for them at all. The camp was a reflection of the society that built it. The abundance was not a performance for their benefit. It was the baseline reality of their captors. The jazz on the radio, the copies of Life magazine in the library filled with advertisements for cars and refrigerators. This was not propaganda. It was just America talking to itself. And they were simply forced to overhear the conversation. The impersonality of it all was the true prison. It stripped them of their own narrative. They were no longer protagonists in a grand, tragic struggle. They were administrative files in a cabinet, items on a manifest, mouths to be fed according to regulation. The enemy had not defeated them with force of arms, but with force of administration. The conflict between their ingrained ideology and their new environment soon found a new arena, the abstract concepts of labor and leisure. In the world they had left behind, work was a moral imperative, a sacred duty to the state. Every woman's effort was a brick in the edifice of the nation. Work was purposeful, even if it was grueling. It was about production, sacrifice, and contribution to the collective struggle. Here, in Hereford, the very concept of work was warped into something unrecognizable. The camp authorities, following the protocols of the Geneva Convention, offered the women opportunities to work for pay. They could earn 80 cents a day, a sum that felt both insultingly small and absurdly generous. In camp scrip, a form of currency valid only at the post exchange. The work itself felt like a parody. Pyrrha, the pragmatic farm woman, was assigned to a detail in the camp garden. She had imagined neat rows of vegetables, a productive plot that would supplement the kitchen. Instead, she was handed packets of flower seeds, zinnias, marigolds. Her task was to cultivate beauty in the middle of a prison. The act felt profoundly wasteful. She would spend hours on her knees in the hot Texas sun, her hands in the rich soil, cultivating uselessness. It felt like a Sisyphean task, a punishment designed by a bored god. Other work details were just as strange. Mending socks for the male prisoners in another section of the camp. Typing administrative forms in English, a language most of them barely understood. The tasks were designed not for production, but for occupation. The goal was not to create value, but to consume time. The inverse of work, leisure, was an even more alien concept. In wartime Italy, there was no leisure. There was only work and exhaustion. Here, time was the most abundant commodity of all. There were hours, entire afternoons, with nothing to do. The authorities provided diversions. A small library was stocked with books in Italian, mostly classics and romance novels, all vetted by military censors. They were offered makeup and magazines at the post-exchange. The idea that a prisoner of war could or should be concerned with the shade of her lipstick was so bizarre it provoked dark, humorless laughter in the barracks. Louisa saw it all as part of the systematic erosion of their character. "They want to turn us into trivial women," she declared. "They want us to forget our duty and think only of lipstick and novels." Yet for some of the younger women, the forced idleness opened up a strange and frightening space. A space for private thought, for doubt. Sophia, who had been a university student, found herself drawn to the dissonant, unpredictable melodies of the jazz on the radio. At first, it was just noise. Then, she began to discern patterns, a kind of conversation between the instruments. It was a music that wasn't about a nation or a leader. It was about a single trumpet, a single piano, a single voice telling a small, personal story. Lying on her cot, listening to that music drift over the dusty compound, she felt the first, terrifying stirrings of a self that was separate from the cause she had pledged her life to. The friction was constant, a low hum of cognitive dissonance that vibrated through the barracks day and night. The women's entire worldview, meticulously constructed by fascist ideology, was predicated on a set of assumptions that this new reality systematically violated. They believed in order, hierarchy, and a clear, martial relationship between captor and captive. They expected harshness, discipline, even cruelty. It was a language they understood. The lack of it was profoundly disorienting. The American Guards were not the brutal conquerors of their propaganda. They were mostly boys, barely out of their teens, dispatched to this strange duty in the middle of nowhere. They seemed baffled by their prisoners. They carried rifles, but held them awkwardly. Their orders were to maintain security, but their interactions were marked by a hesitant, almost shy deference. This inversion of the expected power dynamic was a constant source of confusion. Elena watched as a young guard tried to get the women to form a straight line. His pleas were polite, his tone uncertain. One of the older Italian women, a former schoolteacher named Isabella, strode up to him, corrected his posture with a sharp rap on his shoulder, and barked a single, clear command in Italian. The women snapped into a perfect line. The guard just stared, his mouth slightly open, a flush creeping up his neck. He was a boy playing soldier, faced with women who had been living it. This was not a relationship of oppressor and oppressed. It was something far stranger, something for which they had no name. They were prisoners, but in many ways, they were more disciplined and organized than their keepers. Within the confines of their compound, they recreated the structures they knew. They established a rigid internal hierarchy, with the highest-ranking SAF officer among them acting as their commander. They maintained their own discipline, conducted drills, and held classes on history and ideology. They created a small, functioning society governed by the principles of the state they had served, a phantom republic behind barbed wire. This display of competence and unwavering order was their only remaining weapon. They could not fight the Americans with guns, but they could fight them with their discipline. They could show their captors that even in defeat, they were not broken. They were soldiers. But the question that hung in the silent, windswept nights was a corrosive one. How do you sustain an ideology of heroic struggle when your enemy refuses to struggle with you? Their captors were not engaging them in a battle of wills. They were managing them as a logistical problem. The women's fierce discipline, their ideological lectures, their phantom drills, the Americans seemed to view it all with a kind of mild, anthropological curiosity, like zookeepers observing the strange rituals of a newly acquired species. This benevolent indifference was more maddening than any whip. It suggested that their passionate beliefs, the ideas for which they had sacrificed everything, were simply not important. The evidence of this vast, impersonal system was everywhere, encoded in the paper trail and the material culture of the camp. It was a truth the women pieced together from fragments, each new fact confirming the almost unbelievable reality of their situation. For Elena, the camp newsletter became a primary source. Distributed weekly, it was a simple mimeograph sheet detailing schedules and announcements. She would translate it for the others, her voice flat and methodical. This week's movie screening, Meet Me in St. Louis, starring Judy Garland. Notice, prisoners are reminded not to hoard food items from the mess hall. Tonnage of supplies received this month, 12 tons. The dry figures, the mundane announcements, build a picture of a world operating on principles of routine and plenty. The names and numbers were alien, but the sheer volume they implied was not. It spoke of a power that was administrative, not martial. Pira, assigned to a temporary work detail in the post-exchange warehouse, had a more direct encounter with the evidence. For 2 days, she helped unload crates. Her hands, which knew the weight of a sack of potatoes or a bushel of wheat, now handled cases of things she had never imagined existing in such quantities. She saw the ledgers, the shipping manifests. 500 tubes of Tangy lipstick, 1,000 bars of Hershey's chocolate, 200 copies of Life magazine, 700 cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes. It was a supply list for an army, but an army of consumers. She saw the careful check marks, the signatures, the whole bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to ensuring that even in this remote corner of Texas, the supply chain of American desire remained unbroken. This, she realized, was the true engine of the war. Not ideology, not patriotism. It was this, the relentless, astonishing ability to make and move things. The daily schedule, posted on a board outside the mess hall, was another piece of evidence. It imposed a rhythm on their lives that was both rigid and devoid of meaning. Breakfast 0700. Work call 0830. Lunch 1200. Recreation 1400. Dinner 1800. Lights out 2200. The schedule was the cage. It was a structure designed to manage bodies in time and space, with no regard for the minds inside them. It was the timetable of a factory whose product was simply the passage of another day without incident. Perhaps the most poignant evidence came from a male. Their letters home were heavily censored. A woman named Julia received a letter back from her sister in Bologna, a letter that had passed through the hands of both Italian and American censors. Entire lines were blacked out, but her sister had used a simple code they had arranged. She had written about a neighbor who was terribly thin, a euphemism for starving. Julia had written a letter a month before describing, in a state of shock, a meal of roast beef and potatoes. She later saw her own letter, a copy returned for some violation, and the entire paragraph about the food had been excised by the American censor. The truth, she understood, was a weapon. Her description of life in the camp was considered too dangerous to be read in a city of empty stomachs. The shame of it burned in her. The abundance that surrounded her was not a gift. It was a wall, separating her from the suffering of her own people. She was a well-fed ghost, haunted by the hunger of everyone she loved. The psychological cost of this enforced, unnatural paradise began to mount. The relentless comfort, the absence of struggle, did not bring peace. It brought a slow, creeping unraveling. The cognitive dissonance was a constant pressure, a headache behind the eyes that never faded. For women conditioned to find meaning in sacrifice, a life without it felt meaningless. The abundance was a source of profound, unending guilt. Every meal was an act of betrayal. Every full stomach was an insult to their starving families back home. Some women grew sick from the rich food, their bodies physically rejecting a diet they had not known for years. Others found they could not sleep. In the dead of the Texas night, the silence of the plains was an accusation. It was a silence purchased by the noise of bombs falling on Italian cities. Lying on their narrow cots, they would stare into the darkness and be tormented by visions of home. Pira would imagine her brother, still fighting somewhere in the mountains. Was he cold? Was he hungry? The thought of him gnawing on a piece of hardtack while she had eaten chocolate cake for dessert was a torment that left her hollowed out by morning. For Louisa, the ideological anchor, the pressure caused cracks in her certainty. She fought it, doubling down on her rhetoric, organizing more lectures on the virtues of fascism, her voice growing sharper, more brittle. But in the quiet moments, doubt was a traitor within. She would catch herself enjoying the warmth of the shower or tapping her foot to a piece of American music. Each involuntary flicker of pleasure felt like a surrender. "This bread is cotton," she whispered fiercely to herself one day, staring at a sandwich. "The music is noise. This is not real." But it was real. Its reality was the most powerful weapon of all. The breaking point often came in small, quiet moments. Julia received another letter from her sister. She took it to a quiet corner of the compound, her hands trembling as she opened it. The news was delivered in stark, simple terms. Her youngest nephew, age 4, had died. The cause was listed as influenza, but the subtext was clear: malnutrition. He had been too weak to fight it off. Julia read the letter twice. She did not cry. The feeling was too cold, too heavy for tears. She folded the piece of paper into a small, perfect square, tucking it into her pocket. She walked over to the useless flower garden where Pyrrha was pulling weeds. She looked at the healthy, vibrant plants, at the dark, rich soil. She looked at the well-fed American guards in their towers. She felt the weight of the good, solid food in her own stomach. And in that moment, the entire ideological structure of her life collapsed, turning to dust. It was not a grand, dramatic shattering. It was a quiet, internal implosion, a sudden, sickening realization of a truth too monstrous to hold. The world was not as she had been told. Justice was not a law of the universe. And she was on the wrong side of the history that was decided not by courage or belief, but by the sheer, brutal arithmetic of calories and steel. The women had been searching for a complex motive, a grand strategy behind their treatment. They assumed it was about them, their beliefs, their souls, their potential conversion. They analyzed every gesture, every offering, as a move in a psychological chess game. The turn, the revelation that reordered their entire understanding, was the slow dawning, chilling realization that it was not a game at all. And they were not the prize. The Americans were not trying to convert them. They were simply processing them through a system that was a direct, unthinking extension of their own society. This was the thesis that crystallized in Elena's mind as she watched the camp operate, month after month. It was a truth that emerged not from a single event, but from the accumulated weight of 1,000 mundane observations. The revelation carried with it a series of devastating implications. First, it meant that their captors' greatest power was not malice or cunning, but an indifferent, overwhelming logistical force. The women had been prepared to fight an ideological war, to resist propaganda, to endure hardship. But you could not fight a supply chain. You could not mount a defense against a bill of lading. Their fierce, deeply held beliefs were simply irrelevant to the machinery that now contained them. The system did not need to argue with their fascism. It simply made it obsolete by rendering its core tenets, scarcity, sacrifice, struggle, meaningless. The second implication was even more profound. The American way of life they witnessed was not a carefully curated performance for their benefit. It was real. The casual waste, the endless supply of consumer goods, the optimistic, individualistic music. This was not a facade. It was the genuine cultural product of the society that held them captive. This meant their own system had not been defeated by a superior army, but by a superior reality. The American system produced so much surplus that it could project it across an ocean and into the heart of a prison camp, not as a weapon, but as a simple byproduct. To realize that your enemy's casual, everyday reality is more powerful than your own most profound ideals is a defeat from which there is no recovery. Finally, the revelation clarified their own ideology's fatal flaw. It was a belief system designed for a specific context, a world of poverty, of limited resources, of constant struggle. It thrived on hardship. It drew its strength from sacrifice. Confronted with a world where sacrifice was unnecessary and comfort was the default, it had no answer. It simply dissolved. The core of their faith was rendered inert, like a saltwater fish thrown into a freshwater lake. It could not survive the new environment. The system didn't persuade them. It overwhelmed them. It didn't break their will. It made their will irrelevant. The story of the women at Hereford becomes, then, a story of two systems colliding, with the human consequences measured in quiet, personal moments of disbelief and disillusionment. Pira's neatly folded paper napkins, saved out of a lifetime of ingrained habit, were a testament to a worldview of scarcity rendered nonsensical in a world of surplus. Louise's tormented rejection of every comfort was the desperate struggle of an ideology that could only define itself in opposition to a hardship that was no longer present. And Elena's meticulous, silent accounting of the camp supplies was an attempt to map the sheer, unassailable logic of the system that had imprisoned them. These individual responses were all symptoms of the same fundamental encounter. One system, the Italian fascist state of Salo, was a command economy built for total war, premised on the mobilization of a poor country's limited resources through ideological fervor and brutal coercion. Its virtues were sacrifice, discipline, and the negation of the individual for the state. The other system, the American wartime economy, was a consumer capitalist society of mass production temporarily repurposed for military ends. Its inherent logic was not sacrifice, but efficiency and volume. It defeated its enemies not by being more frugal, but by producing more of everything. This systemic difference explains the strange reality of the camp. The logic of industrial mass production, perfected in American factories, led directly to standardized, high-calorie military rations. The logic of international treaty, a product of a world order the United States sought to lead, dictated that these same rations be given to prisoners. The unintended consequence of these two interlocking systems was a profound psychological and ideological crisis for a small group of women whose entire existence had been shaped by the opposite principles. The experience at Hereford suggests that power, particularly cultural and ideological power, is not always exercised through persuasion or force. It can be transmitted through the mundane logistics of everyday life. The values of a society are embedded in its material culture, in its food, its products, its waste. A hamburger is not just a meal. It is an argument for a world of cheap grain and plentiful meat. A disposable razor is not just a tool. It is an argument for a world where resources are so abundant one need not conserve them. The camp at Hereford tends to show that abundance itself can become a form of power, one that can dismantle an ideology of scarcity more effectively than any platoon of soldiers or any propaganda leaflet. The women were not defeated by what the Americans said, but by what they threw away. Elena stands by the window of the mess hall, months after her arrival. In her hand, she holds a glass of Coca-Cola. It is no longer a mystery. The weight of the glass is familiar now. The condensation is expected. She watches the bubbles rise and pop, but she is not thinking of poison or magic. She is thinking of factories, of sugar refineries, of bottling plants, of trucks, of ships, of logistics. She understands that this object in her hand is not a symbol. It is a commodity, the end point of a long, complex, and entirely impersonal process. A process that won a war. She takes a sip. The fizz still stings. The sweetness still coats her tongue. But the shock is gone. The bewilderment has been replaced by a cold, hard clarity. It is just sugar water. Its power was never in the liquid itself, but in everything it took to get it to her hand. The official history of a war is written in the language of battles, treaties, and grand strategies. But the lived history, the human history, is often found in the small material details. It is found in what is eaten, what is worn, and what is discarded. It is a story told by a slice of soft white bread, by the sound of strange new music, by the sight of a half-eaten apple tossed carelessly aside. Notice what changes when we view the past, not only through the eyes of generals, but through the hands of a woman holding a ration she was never meant to receive, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. The women of Hereford were eventually sent back to an Italy that was as broken and destitute as America was prosperous. Their story did not end in Texas. Their greatest struggle was just beginning, to navigate a future in a homeland they no longer recognized, armed with the strange and bitter knowledge of the world they had seen behind the wire. To understand how they carried that knowledge back into their shattered lives, subscribe for our next episode.